Once in a Blue Moon by Norman L. Knight. This story has had but 3 sparse appearances. First, in the August 1942 issue of Future Combined with Science Fiction magazine. Second, in the January 1960 issue of Science Fiction Stories magazine. And finally, in a 1970 anthology called Blue Moon, an anthology of science fiction stories. Read by Darrell T. Smith II for my channel, Quasar Spectra. Once in a Blue Moon. The opening phase of exploration beyond the circuit of the solar planets was pervaded by a spirit of headlong pursuit of horizons that had receded to infinity, by a sense of unprecedented release, of inexhaustible novelty, of the bursting of world-old barriers. Mars, unexpectedly more kindred than had been surmised, and Earth alike, flung their ships among the stars at ever-mounting velocities in a reckless fury of discovery, and uncounted voyagers on those ships perished in an endless variety of ways, fantastic, dismal, or shocking. Speedily, it was realized that the stellar universe was not merely a bottomless Pandora's box of opportunity and wonder, but that it was also a realm brutally indifferent to the welfare of alien explorers. And the explorers were not alone in their misfortunes. The parent worlds and their far-flung colonies were ravaged by strange epidemics, which slipped past the tightest quarantines, and for which remedial measures usually were forthcoming only after prolonged and hectic research. Indiscreet importations of plant and animal life at times thrived exuberantly until they became either a pest or a menace. Insidious cumulative effects of foreign atmospheres, water supplies, or foods annihilated whole colonies. Contact with the solar cultures decimated luckless indigenous races on foreign worlds or heavily curtailed some essential resources. The next phase was one of more sober judgment, maturer caution, and systematic control over the process of expansion. The traditions of the first untrammeled rovers were perpetuated in some measure by the primary reconnaissance cruisers, whose courses ranged outward into the galaxy in an ever-widening sphere. These vessels accurately charted the locations and characteristics of stars, the orbits and number of attendant planets, and the obstacles and aids to navigation. Above all, they noted the locations of suitable worlds, that is to say, worlds which might be suitable for colonization by the solar races. Such craft were strictly forbidden to land upon any uncertified world or to penetrate its atmosphere, or even to collect samples of the atmosphere with remote-controlled sounding shells. They were in fact prohibited from approaching within less than 2,000 miles of any planetary body with an atmosphere. Such stringent precautions were designed to prevent the interworld transport of undesirable spores or other minute floating organisms, whose existence alive in the soft vacuum zone surrounding other worlds has been abundantly, sometimes tragically, demonstrated. Following the report of a suitable world by the primary cruiser, a vessel dispatched by the Interworld Sanitary Service would survey it minutely from the standpoint of public health and hygiene. The sanitary service craft were known as caduceus ships, since they displayed the ancient emblem of the serpent-entwined staff of Hermes. They were huge globular affairs approaching a small asteroid in size, and carried within themselves smaller subsidiary vessels with which the actual landings were effected. It was a primary principle of the sanitary service that no caduceus ship should bring to, nor carry away from any world, before that world had been certified, any microorganisms save those in its bacteriological laboratory, which was separated from the remainder of the interior by impregnable bulkheads and approached through quadruple airlocks. The Caduceus ship itself made no landing, but remained in the vicinity of the world under observation, sending down supplies or receiving samples and cultures in remote-controlled craft, which were sterilized on their return to the mothership. The narrative which presently we shall proceed to relate concerns certain findings reported by the ship Caduceus of Alcor, out of Alcor Haven, a colonized world revolving about the star Alcor in Ursa Major. The planet which is the subject of this report has come to be known as Kenya, after a region on the terrestrial continent of Africa, for reasons which will appear in due course. It accompanies the star Azuran in the neighborhood of Alpha Draconis, visible from Alcor Haven, but not from Earth, because of intervening clouds of opaque matter. The report above mentioned was compiled by Counselor Jeffrey Saracen, the advisor and director of the landing party, and while it gives a lucid, scholarly, and technical account of the biological and hygienic aspects of life on Kenya, including the peculiar civilization of the wall makers, it omits equally interesting personal matters. The latter are recorded in Counselor Saracen's private log and in the writings of the Herodotus of the Spaceways, the earthborn Martian Ilrai the Younger. Ilrai's presence on a ship of the sanitary service seems curious when one learns that he had no official connection therewith, but there is evidence that he was an adept at wire pulling and the application of diplomatic persuasion in influential quarters. He appears to have spent half of his life turning up in strange places. He was disturbed by the fact that the diffusion of the solar races had outstripped their means of rapid communication, and feared that they were in danger of losing their sense of unity. Therefore, he conceived of writing and publishing on an interworld scale, a sort of conglomerate prose epic concerning unusual and widely dispersed events, which should be the basis of a universal literature. The Galactic Chronicles were the result, and had grown to 31 volumes at his death midway of the 27th century. At that time, our migration through the galaxy was a slow and creeping progress, or so it seems today. The fastest cruiser then in existence, if it could have reached maximum speed instantly and maintained it uninterruptedly for the span of an average human lifetime, could have traveled only halfway along the longest galactic diameter. Even so, the ships traveled faster than the fastest means of signaling them known. The discovery of the vibratory gravitational beam, which led to the stereophone, was an event still in the future. But our story lies in the past, in the year 2615 A.D., and it begins in the cabin of Captain Jutland, the skipper of the Caduceus of Alcor. 1. So far as we can tell from here, Saracen, this AL-237 seems to be a fairly decent sort of a world, as planets go, declared Captain Jutland. The daylight side has been completely blanketed by clouds and thunderstorms ever since we arrived. It will be queer living under a blue sun, but probably you'll never see it, only a sort of blue twilight filtering through the clouds. It's always clear and apparently calm on the dark side, and I'd advise landing there. No need to feel your way through a 2 or 3 mile depth of storm clouds, if you don't have to. The odds are that you won't run into any especially perplexing problems unless the thing's inhabited, and we've had no chance to see any markings of structures during the day on account of the clouds. You're fortunate in taking down your first landing party on what may be a comparatively simple mission, but I don't need to tell you these things. You've followed the findings up to date. I have, and they seem too favorable to be true, responded Counselor Saracen. Gravity about 1/5 more than Alcor Haven's, Atmosphere breathable with about twice our accustomed amount of oxygen, the rest mainly nitrogen. The samples of air and water that were brought up by the soundings gave mostly negative results. The cultures grown from them were practically innocuous. Some white rats broke out with green freckles on their bellies but didn't seem to care. 3 Martian Ikrangs showed signs of lassitude, ran a slight temperature, recovered in 45 hours. Himberling isolated the toxin and synthesized the antibody in both cases. Captain Jutland leaned forward in his chair. Now, here's some information you won't relish. Ilrai has asked to be included in your party. Saracen stiffened. I couldn't refuse him even if I wanted to, which I don't. Jutland continued. He has an official authorization a yard long under the biplanetary seal, which permits him to go anywhere and to see anything, so long as in so doing he doesn't interfere with official work or expose others to unreasonable hazards. If you prefer not to assume the counselorship under such conditions, I might offer you my permission to withdraw now, but I'm not going to do that either. It would do your record no good. If you persist in this attitude of irrational hostility toward Martians, it will seriously limit your value to the service. It's an obsession. It's an indication of emotional unbalance. You may as well face it and resolve to overcome it. This is an official disapproval of my personal opinions, I take it, remarked the counselor coldly. I'm not concerned about your personal opinions if they don't reduce your serviceability, blast it, exploded Jutland. And strictly speaking, I'm not disapproving. I'm attempting an operation in mental surgery. But that may be what your case calls for. Possibly we could cure you painlessly by hypnosis, but I'd rather see you cure yourself. I don't have to be a mastermind to diagnose your ailment. You're accustomed to being versatile, able, more than ordinarily successful in your undertakings, so you feel everlastingly humiliated when you're detailed for training in mental transmission and find that you're a total bilateral incompetent. That's being juvenile. Only about 5% of the human race are A1 telepaths anyway, and another 5% are blackouts like you. The Martians are something else. Their worst is better than our best. That's why the training is in their hands. There's nothing disgraceful in having an impenetrable mind. In fact, there's always a spot for anyone with a mind like that. No one else can project his thoughts into it, and it can't inadvertently transmit its own. You should be elated that not even a Martian can tell what you're thinking. Unless we have something further to say, there are other matters which need my attention, remarked Saracen. All right, that's all. Shove off, and the best of luck. But think it over. 3. The contact ship Hermes lay in her launching tunnel, her nose pointed at the 80-ton plug of the airlock in the outer skin of the Caduceus. She was a hybrid craft, a streamlined sea-going space cruiser, double-keeled to provide a firm base upon a solid surface and to permit stable navigation on a body of water for economy of lift power. Counselor Saracen faced his landing party in the mess room of the Hermes. Half the company were telepaths of various degrees of ability, and he was certain that a darting interchange of thought proceeded among them. His resentment focused itself upon Ilrai. The Martian towered 3 feet above the heads of the Earthlings, his battery of eyes, equally spaced around the equator of his faceless cranium, rendered it impossible to judge at what point his attention was directed. In a few moments, when I give word, the launching tunnel will be evacuated of air, began Saracen, struggling to suppress an irritated conviction that Ilrai was not paying attention. Although the Martian lacked organs of speech, like all members of his race, he possessed adequate hearing. For some of us, as for me, this is the first time that we've been accepted for this kind of service. We are about to become, for an indefinite period, virtual exiles on a new world. We shall become laboratory animals just as truly as the humbler creatures we are taking with us. Let me repeat that. Once we've landed, there will be no return until we are certain that we have not become carriers for some alien virus. Our results from the samples dredged up by the sounding shells are hopeful but not conclusive. It may be that we shall be stricken by some malady which we cannot cure. Even the resources of the caduceus may not develop a technique in time to save us. Years of study may be necessary. We know that such things have happened. If, now that this venture is real and imminent in our minds, some of you may wish to withdraw, so you may do so without prejudice. Ample replacements are available. This is the last chance. A silence followed, in which Ilrai jotted down another entry in his interminable notes. The faint sound of scribbling annoyed Counselor Saracen. Ilrai wrote, I have seen little of this earthling Saracen. On the outward voyage, the absolute impregnability of his mind fascinates me. It is said that he harbors an unfaltering antipathy toward my race. Certainly I have found him invariably aloof. Perhaps he will be more approachable after we have landed. Since no one speaks to the contrary, we shall cast off at once, ordered Saracen. Go to your stations. The plug of the airlock was a huge cylinder transverse to the tunnel, pierced by a tube. When the interior of the tunnel had been exhausted to a high vacuum, the cylinder rotated smoothly, brought the tube into alignment with the tunnel, and the Hermes glided through into the star-dusted black in a transient, misty puff of residual air vapor and ice crystals. She departed silently, driven by a space warp mosaic. In less technical terms, by an invisible sheath of overlapping artificial gravitational fields under individual micro-control. The field strengths could be varied over a range of 20 Earth gravities, 10 plus to 10 minus, a relatively low-velocity job. Hooded instrument lights glowed in the shadowy navigation room, irradiated the hands of Counselor Saracen as they moved among the levers of the control table. He was strapped to his seat in anticipation of a rough passage. On either side of him, also strapped in place, were Sancabriel, his navigator, and Himberling, the chief pathologist, each capable of taking the helm if need arose. The eyes of all three were fixed on the conning screen. A field of black, quartered by luminous crosshairs, and powdered with stars like carelessly strewn handfuls of shining sand. The globe of a sapphire sun dominated the field, etched the three intent faces in tones of blue against the semi-obscurity. Azeran, our future son for the rest of our lives, perhaps, quietly remarked Saracen. First time I've seen it like this, Himberling observed. I haven't looked outside since the first week of Alkerhaven. Beautiful corona, like a textbook picture of a magnetic field. This shows it in reduced intensity, of course. I should hope so, returned the helmsman. The screen couldn't reproduce its full intensity in the first place. It's a terrifically active star. We'll have no naked eye views of it until we're under cover of an atmosphere, if the clouds ever break during the day. It built up an enormous static charge on the caduceus, and we're carrying part of that charge with us. Give me the bow televisor, Himberling. With a click, the picture was transformed, and a planetary crescent appeared, close at hand and immense, fleecy with the texture of clouds, drenched with a soft celestial blue. A pinpoint sparkling of perpetual lightnings animated it from cusp to cusp. The dark part of the sphere was visible as a fragile-seeming veil of dim turquoise. Riding close above the curved rim of this shadowy veil was another smaller crescent, a bright sickle of blue quicksilver. "And it's down on the chart as AL-237," exclaimed Saracen. "I didn't know that it has a satellite." remarked Himberling. The Hermes built up her down drag to 5 gravities plus, then went neutral and coasted. The planet now loomed so enormous that only a small part of the dark side was visible on the conning screen, but with a still obvious convexity. "There must be a permanent auroral sheath under us in the high atmosphere," observed the counselor. "It fogs the details. I haven't seen a continent or a big ocean on this side, just hundreds of islands. Himberling, cut in a filter and see if we can get rid of part of this blue veil, then intensify the image some more." The conning screen assumed a bluish-green tinge, and the blurred archipelago became sharper in outline, dark masses on a slightly paler background. "Head braces," ordered Saracen. "I'm going to decelerate." The 3 men slipped on helmets and chin straps which were anchored to the high-backed seats. The helmsman flipped levers, began the slow turning of a dial, and the Hermes became negatively gravitating. Instantly the 3 men were gripped by a force which sought to tear them from their steel-framed chairs and hurl them against the control table. Their retaining straps creaked and their heartbeats thudded in their ears. "That's an odd sort of marking," exclaimed Sancabriel sharply, his eyes fixed on the screen. "It's too symmetrical to be natural." The screen was almost entirely filled by the image of a large island. To the unaided human eye, it would have been shrouded in darkness, but the amplifying televisor rendered its topography dimly visible by reflected moonlight. At the head of an estuary in the upper right-hand quadrant of the screen, a feebly luminous spot had appeared, circular in shape, with a regularly scalloped circumference. It suggested the outline of a conventionalized chrysanthemum. As the Hermes plummeted nearer, the likeness became even more startling. Telescopic enlargement revealed an internal structure of pale-colored lines enclosing darker areas. Specifically, they formed concentric zones of semicircular arcs, a precise representation of the overlapping petals of a composite flower. "To show this large, at our distance, it must be at least 100 miles across," hazarded Sancabriel. A shrill whine sang through the hull of the Hermes. "First contact with atmosphere," observed Counselor Saracen. "We have nearly ceased falling. Now the jockeying begins." The jockeying process was rather like a descent in an elevator. The Hermes would fall under positive gravity until her velocity and air friction mounted unduly, then would go slightly negative for a few seconds, then positive again. In the high stratosphere, the vessel's huge static charge produced visible effects. She became enveloped in a nimbus of pale apple-green fire, which fluttered from her double keel in ever-lengthening downward pennants. Searching auroral fingers rose up to meet them. As she dropped lower, the normally calm nocturnal atmosphere around her began to churn with unaccustomed commotion. During the intervals when portions of her enveloping gravitational mosaic were negative, air was forcibly repelled in those directions, rushed in shrieking from others, and set up an atmospheric maelstrom. By the time she had dropped to a 3-mile altitude, the vessel was the nucleus of a vivid thunderstorm. She careened and plunged while the clouds boiled around her and enmeshed her in a net of lightning. The bolts raked her impervious sheathing from stern to stern, spouted from her salient points in sheets of crashing flame. When the synthetic storm had exhausted its first violence, the Hermes drifted downward in a deluge of rain and hail, her apparent weight adjusted to slightly exceed her air buoyancy. "We're landing blind, just as if we had come down on the daylight side," grumbled Saracen, divesting himself of his safety straps. "This planet has a very touchy atmosphere. I never saw a ship stir up such a tempest while making port on Alkerhaven. What's it like under us, Sancabriel?" Sancabriel probed the cloudy depths with the echo beam and reported, "Flat as a tabletop." We must be over water. The Hermes first descended on a barely submerged mud flat, into which she began to sink with gargantuan slobbering noises. To lift herself out, she cautiously went negative. This maneuver hurled back water, mud, and boulders in a foaming elliptical tidal wave, which returned, rumbling and frothing, when she went positive again, found and lowered herself into deeper water, flowing smoothly and swiftly. A triad of bulges below the water line at her stern opened up and broke out propellers. Another bulge on her shield deck yawned apart and protruded a searchlight as she came about into the current and dropped anchor. The space shields descended, whirring, from her observation boards. "We'll ride here until the weather clears and decide on our next move," announced Counselor Saracen as he followed the disclosures of the searchlight beam with his binoculars through the thick silicoid of a port. The beam was streaked with diamond darts of slackening rain. "I'd say we're on a river. There's one bank, and I suppose that's vegetation, though it looks more like a forest of oversized sponges, porous masses. Did you ever see such a malignant shade of green? Let's have a look at the port side." The light beam swung through half a turn, and the observers moved across the navigation room to another port. "Do you see what I see?" demanded Sancabriel. An extraordinary barrier reared itself along the river's edge, its foundations planted in the water. It was the color of antique weather-beaten ivory, green-stained near water level, pockmarked and pitted like a termite-eaten timber. Razor-edged spikes and bayonets of glassy stuff projected from its summit in a formidable fringe, which reflected sparks and sprays of light. The beam followed the structure along the river, found where it turned inland, mounted a ridge, and passed over the crest. "It's a wall, and it didn't just grow there," declared Himberling, "and whoever or whatever put it there was bent on keeping something out, something which was expected to come from this side." 3. The light beam had been extinguished. Insensibly, the darkness around the Hermes took on an indigo tinge, a growing premonition of an unearthly moonlight which struggled through the dissolving clouds. With the passing of those clouds, the river, its banks forested with spongy domes, and the spike-crowned wall became an insubstantial fantasy in ethereal blue, as remote from reality as nirvana. The bright cerulean moon, nearing the full, rode in a sky like a theatrical backdrop, luminous blue-violet, filmed over by an auroral haze which concealed all but the greater stars. Counselor Saracen again had assembled his company in the mess room, whose portholes looked across the blue-lit waters toward the enigmatic wall. "Tomorrow, after we have rested, our work begins," he was saying. "Under no conditions is anyone to leave ship unprotected by safety units until we know more about the effects of our new atmosphere, and until we are more familiar with conditions on this world, those who go out must not venture beyond." An overhead communicator clicked, and Sancabriel spoke from the navigation room, where he had remained on watch. "Something's coming over the ridge. You can see it from down there. It's making a ghastly noise. I'll cut you in on the outside mic." There was a general movement to the portholes as a deep-throated, lugubrious sound issued from the communicator. It might have been called either mooing or groaning. The lights in the mess room were hurriedly switched off. Saracen still carried his binoculars slung over his shoulder and made haste to train them on the skyline of the ridge. Near the horizon, the violet-blue sky brightened to a lighter zone of blue-green, and against this zone of brightness was silhouetted what appeared to be the swaying neck and expanded hood of a giant cobra, featureless save for a row of 4 silver-blue luminous eyes. A tall, sharp horn rose from the creature's head like an obelisk. The Hermes light beam leaped across the water, impinged upon this apparition, disclosed a craggy head and columnar neck encased in green-black jointed armor with a coppery iridescence. What had seemed to be an expanded hood revealed itself as a pair of flexible arms, tightly coiled against the armored neck just below the head. The creature hurriedly unfurled these arms, shaded its eyes against the glare with frog-fingered, unhuman hands in an oddly human gesture, and began to advance stiffly, mechanically, as if fascinated by the intense light. "It's half as high as the wall!" exclaimed Sancabriel. "Here comes the rest of it." "How high is the wall?" thought Councillor Saracen. The body of the beast was not unlike that of a great armor-plated caterpillar furnished with 5 pairs of stumpy elephantine legs. In the intervals between its dismal groaning, a harsh panting was audible, like the laboring of giant lungs. "That other sound isn't what you think it is," Sancabriel declared. "Our 10-legged friend ashore has nothing to do with it. It's from another direction, inland toward the wall, and it's growing louder. Something else is astir. If I'm not mistaken, it's creeping along in the shadow of the wall. We'll have a look." The light beam swung toward the wall and played along the portion which extended back from the river, then halted suddenly. A dome of steel surmounted by a turret was lurching forward on tractor treads, close to the base of the wall. Twin jets of steam spurted rhythmically from its underbody, and a thin cloud of pale vapor trailed in its wake. Since it was no longer held in thrall by the Hermes searchlight, the armored decapod now became aware of the clanking, hissing newcomer and charged upon it with guttural whooping, running with surprising agility upon its short legs. When a headlong crash seemed imminent, the steel turret rotated slightly and spat out a roaring jet of steam, which enveloped the monster's head in a billowing white cloud. It recoiled from this assault, humping its body into an arch which lifted its middle pairs of feet from the ground and pawed frantically at its head with its serpentine arms. Then it turned, pounded up the slope and over the ridge. The onlookers aboard the Hermes turned thoughtful eyes upon each other. "This complicates matters," commented Himberling, who stood beside Saracen. "We'll have to come to an understanding with whatever things built that machine before we can go on with our work. I'd like to see what's at the wheel." Himberling's curiosity did not go long unsatisfied. The lumbering vehicle crept down to the water's edge, turned broadside to the Hermes, and stopped. A door opened in the turret, and a dark figure crawled out, stood erect on the dome. For a moment, no one quite comprehended what they saw, since they had expected some bizarre, unfamiliar creature. "It's a man, a human being," came Sancabriel's voice from the communicator. "Or is it? Is there such a thing as a black human being?" Ilrai, who stood at the porthole beyond Himberling, was aware that the same question was disturbing many of the other minds about him, and so broadcast a thought. "It is indeed true that what we see is a man," thought Ilrai. "A considerable proportion of the terrestrial human population is of the black variety and have added their own unique contribution to Earth's culture. It is only because the human race has expanded so far and so rapidly that you never heard of them or have forgotten what you may have heard." "Ilrai is right. We're spreading out too fast," affirmed Himberling when he had relayed Ilrai's remarks verbally to Councillor Saracen, who listened with cool politeness. "At least a third of this company have never heard of the black race." "I have heard of black men, but I've never seen one," returned the councillor. "There are none on Alcorhaven, and there's no record of any previous landing on this world. We must go to this stranger and question him." 4. Himberling and 2 others emerged on the shield deck of the Hermes. The others were Ilrai and a girl named Rodney Ames, who possessed a specialized knowledge of terrestrial dialects. Possible difficulties were foreseen in conversing with the stranger, but, as was soon discovered, Rodney's linguistic services were not needed. Ilrai had reported only slight success in attempting a mental contact. I receive no impression save that of great emotional turmoil, and he does not respond to my efforts, the Martian informed Himberling. He may be only slightly receptive. The 3 were clad in airtight transparent safety suits filled with oxygen cylinders. The headpieces were mere tough, transparent films stretched over a light framework, since they were subject to no inequality in pressure, which permitted ordinary conversation at close range between non-telepaths without the encumbrance of telephonic apparatus. As a routine precaution, all were armed with small caliber weapons intermediate between a pistol and a rifle, firing explosive rocket bullets. Strapped around their bodies were individualized adaptations of the space warp drive known as levitation harness, which could reduce the apparent weight of the wearer and his equipment almost to zero, so that he was rendered air buoyant if desired. Gravitationally, he became equivalent to a human-shaped vacuum bubble in the air. Locomotion with this gadget consisted of a series of immense leaps, or a sort of air swimming with collapsible bat wings, attached to the arms and body. Athletic aviation of this sort was practical only in relatively calm weather such as then prevailed. Leaping in rapid succession, the trio launched themselves from the shield deck, arched like blue moths across the intervening water, guided themselves with dexterous flapping toward their objective. They descended a little distance from the perambulating dome and advanced with guns held discreetly at the ready, but were reassured by the behavior of the man from the machine. He was trembling uncontrollably. When Himberling stepped into the garish spotlight of the Hermes beam, the stranger's legs went limp under him, and he tumbled clumsily to his knees. In this posture he shambled toward Himberling, fell forward, and clutched him around the hips. Himberling was momentarily nonplussed by the stranger's eyes, which searched his own with a desperate incredulity. They were deep-set in a face which might have been carved from teak, seamed with wrinkles like gullies under a skull-fitting growth of grizzled, kinky hair. The stranger's lips moved, but no words came forth. "Here now! What's your trouble? Pull yourself together," said Himberling uncomfortably. In response came 2 words, spoken hoarsely. "How long?" "He's a castaway," ejaculated Rodney. "He wants to know how long he's been here." "A castaway careering around in a steam-driven machine?" rejoined Himberling skeptically. "Then, who are you? When did you land?" "Matawamba, in 2583, from the land on Kenya, on Earth. How long is that?" "In 2583? repeated Rodney. "Why, that's 32 years ago." "Only 32? I couldn't tell. Time is different here." "His mind is a whirl of strange pictures," Ilrai thought to Himberling. "I cannot yet piece them together. He is unaware of my thoughts. His brain has not been trained to listen." "I can't get through to him either," Himberling thought back. "This will have to be a verbal interview." With Rodney's assistance, Himberling raised the shock-weakened Matawamba to his feet and led him over to the machine, where they seated themselves on a projecting flange of the tread casing. Ilrai folded up his long, double-jointed legs and sat before them on the ground. The Hermes beam shining upon him from the rear, irradiated his translucent body like an image of cloudy, many-colored glass, revealed the shadowy outlines of his skeleton. "Now tell us how you came here," continued Himberling. "Was there no one with you?" "I was alone," said Matawamba, "in a lifeboat of the Marco Polaris. Sudden death came to the ship. The captain died on the bridge. The pilot died in the helm." "The Marco Polaris?" Ilrai flashed to Himberling. I know that ship. It was lost in transit." "What do you mean by sudden death?" demanded Himberling, professionally interested. "What was it like?" "We can go into that afterwards," declared Rodney. "Go on." "Some died while they ran to the lifeboats," Matawamba went on. "No one came with me to mine. I was afraid to wait, so I went alone. This was the only planet in sight. I knew scarcely anything about navigation, so I came down very crookedly and crashed in the outlands. I broke my wrist and 3 ribs and my watch. If I'd had my watch—" "What do you mean by the outlands?" asked Rodney. "Well, out there," said Matawamba, and gestured widely away from the wall toward the ridge and the river. "Why was the Marco Polaris leaving Earth?" inquired Himberling, prompted by Ilrai. "Because the people in it were weary of Earth," Matawamba responded. "Life was changing strangely. Everything was in upheaval. Everywhere men and women seemed driven to throw themselves into some great scheme to change things. There was no more peace, no more solitude. Then we read in a book, in A Spaceman's Tale, about a world of Polaris. They said it was a perfect world. It was written by a Martian named Ilrai." Ilrai started, his invincible equanimity shattered for the first time in years. "That report was a bit premature," observed Himberling, smiling covertly. "It was rather hastily called Eden, as I remember. The first colonists were overwhelmed by spectacular landscapes and a wonderful climate, but it proved to be no better and no worse than Earth." "Pardon the interruption," Rodney broke in, "but I think that some more local wildlife is coming our way. I've heard it twice, and I don't like its voice. It was louder the second time." An attentive silence followed. Then the blue serenity of the night was sliced across by a shrill, hooting wail. The echoes ran around the horizon like a vast cry of despair. 5. Rodney, Himberling, and Ilrai leaped to their feet and cocked their guns. Matawamba remained seated, regarded them blankly. A pencil of orange light wheeled up into the sky from behind the ridge, swept down to a horizontal position as the light source leaped into view on the summit of the wall where it crested the rise. The light was rushing along the top of the wall toward the mystified watchers, accompanied by a harsh, throbbing hiss. Rodney cried, "Now what?" The nearest portion of the wall was no more than 100 yards away, and that which now sped by upon it left Himberling and Rodney transfixed in inarticulate amazement. A wheeled, elongated contrivance of steel offered a fleeting glimpse of rounded metallic sides, hurried mechanical oscillations, and pulsating steam jets, to be followed by a clicking, clangorous succession of box-like carriages bearing strange inscriptions upon their corrugated sides. Santa Fe, Lackawanna, Missouri Pacific, and Fruit Growers Express. The steam-spitting mechanism uttered a demoniac shriek as it passed, and rumbled on into the night, became 2 eyes of light, one red, one green, receding along the wall. Came another cry, remote, despairing, and was engulfed in blue silence. Himberling drew a deep breath and inquired simply, "What was that?" From a momentary state of rigidity, Matawamba passed into a paroxysmal abandonment to laughter. He was racked and shaken by whooping merriment. He slapped his knees, rocked his body in an agony of mirth, opened his mouth until it threatened to eclipse his face, exposed his teeth and tongue in unobscured entirety. He laughed until he wept. Neither Himberling nor Rodney had ever seen or heard such laughter. "My little locomotive!" gasped Matawamba, quaking with exhaustion and wiping his eyes. "You were afraid of my little locomotive." "Locomotive? Your little locomotive?" ejaculated Himberling, and paused helplessly. "Suppose we begin all over again." "But it was little," Rodney asserted suddenly. "Take another look at the wall. We overestimated its size and distance when we saw it at first. It can't be more than 30 or 40 feet high, and that would make that mechanical nightmare—" "It would make it," began Himberling, and eyed the wall. "Why, it wasn't any bigger than a big working model of what? Come, Matawamba, tell us what goes on here." "On Earth, I taught sidereal linguistics, the comparative philology of the known worlds," replied Matawamba, "at the University of Kenya. In my studies, I rediscovered the ancient jargon of earthly railroading. Do you know what a railroad is?" Himberling searched his memory, received a mental prod from Ilrai. "They taught us in school on Alkerhaven," he responded, "that goods and passengers once were conveyed in steam-driven vehicles running on rails. So that's what we saw. But how can there be a railroad on this world with earthly names on the cars, like Missouri Pacific, for instance? Where do you come in?" "I began by whittling railroads out of wood," continued Matawamba. "Then I made them from brass and steel, complete and functional in every detail. It was my pastime. When we set out on the Marco Polaris, I took with me a whole microfilm library on railroads. It was the only thing I carried into the lifeboat." "So, after you crashed, you crawled out with a wrist and 3 ribs broken," observed Rodney, "and built a railroad?" "I haven't told you the rest of it," returned Matawamba with a toothful grin. "The wall makers built their own railroads after I showed them how. They already knew about steam power and had invented a steam-driven road carriage like this one we're sitting on. But they hadn't thought of rails or wheels with flanges." "The wall makers," repeated Himberling. "I knew it. Where there is a wall like this, there must be builders. It couldn't just grow." "But it did," asserted Matawamba. "It's alive." "What?" Himberling and Rodney spoke together. "Well, you might call it a sort of dry land corral," Matawamba explained. "The wall makers cause it to grow wherever and in whatever size and shape they want. The walls keep the dynapods out." "The dynapods?" questioned Himberling. "The dynapods. It's just a name I invented. I named this world Kenya also. It seemed a good name. On the chart it goes by virtue of 32 years priority. But what are dynapods?" "The lords of the outlands. You must have seen one, the one I scalded with steam." Rodney had been grappling with a problem and now voiced her perplexity. "You say that these wall makers had already invented machines like this one," she began, tapping the steel tread casing. "Then you say that they have built railroads like the one on the wall, but those cars were miniatures," If I stood alongside one, I believe I could lean my elbows on it. What good is a railroad on that scale? This is my personal transport, especially made for me. It's a kind of tank, but probably you've never heard of that. The wall makers are about so tall. He extended his hand, indicated a height of 2 feet. The railroads are built in proportion. It happens that on this world the dominant race is small. Small compared to man. Small compared to the general scale of things about them. When may we meet these pygmy engineers? When you wish. I came partly to arrange a meeting, partly to ask that you take me back to Kenya. The real Kenya. We saw your ship coming down in the storm, on fire with lightning. I'm afraid you'll have to wait a while before you can return, Himberling said, an apologetic note in his voice. Under the best of conditions, we ourselves will be here for years. When we do go, it will be to Alcorhaven, not Earth, and our communications with Earth are very irregular. When we set out, it had been 5 years since the last mail. It now became necessary to acquaint Matawamba with the functions of the Interworld Sanitary Service, an organization regarding which he had only the sketchiest information. "But I've lived here for 32 years, protested Matawamba, "and I've enjoyed the best of health. I'm your #1 guinea pig. I'll admit that I made myself very sick several times before I knew what were the right things to eat, but as for a real infection, never." "Infection? I'm glad you mentioned that," Himberling rejoined. "You haven't told us what this sudden death was that struck the Marco Polaris." "There was a panic. It was hard to find out just what was happening, but it was called, I think, Cassiopean gangrene." Rodney and Himberling involuntarily moved away from Matawamba, cast startled glances at each other. "And you got away alive?" exclaimed Himberling incredulously. "There's a latent form," Rodney observed. "Very likely that's how it came aboard the Marco Polaris." "You mean—" began Matawamba, and stopped. "The kindest thing I can do is to be brutally frank," began Himberling hesitantly. "Presumably you have been exposed to Cassiopean gangrene. It is one of the most devilishly erratic diseases known and may lie dormant in an unsuspecting host for an amazingly long time. The fact that you survived renders you subject to suspicion, even if it were but the faintest of suspicions. Before you can be allowed to return to Earth, or even to Alcorhaven, you must undergo the most complete and searching examinations known to medical science. In fact, we and all the crew of the Hermes, the ship itself, are, from this moment, under ironclad redoubled quarantine on Kenya. We may be here for life." 6. A frantic warning from Sancabriel sounded in Himberling's brain. The beam of the Hermes searchlight whirled away from the group on the riverbank, leaped up the slope of the ridge, and revealed a long rank of dinopods creeping stealthily over its summit in open formation. The line was so extended that Sancabriel could not hold the beam upon more than one individual at a time. "You go back to the ship," commanded Matawamba. "I'll get through." He ran up the curved side of the dome on a built-in ladder, dived into the turret, slammed the door. "Tell him to get out of that contraption," Sancabriel flashed to Himberling. "We're unlimbering the forward guns. I don't know how these brutes' minds work, but if I were in their place, I'd surround that machine and overturn it, steam or no steam. And if they surround it, we can't shoot at them without blowing it up along with them." But Matawamba's traveling fortress was already rumbling on its way in a cloud of steam and oil fumes. Now that they had been discovered, the phalanx of dinopods thundered down the slope like stampeding elephants. For the first time, the party on the shore appreciated their true size. Each shell-plated neck was as thick as the body of a horse. Then the guns of the Hermes spoke, and apparently simultaneous explosions blasted 3 smoking craters in the hillside. One dynapod was decapitated by a shell. The concussion staggered the remaining dynapods, and the trio at the river's edge, who had already rendered themselves practically weightless, were blown backwards over the water. The headless victim of the salvo blundered onward with stubborn vitality, rammed against the wall. Then a prodigy took place. The wall came to life. Out of the honeycomb of dark pits in the pockmarked barrier there arose legions of long-stemmed polyps, like giant sea anemones, rosy and beautiful under the Hermes' restless beam, their tentacles tipped with curved black fangs. They seized the thrashing body hungrily, held it by sheer force of numbers, pried off its plates of armor with their talons, and proceeded to tear it to shreds. The polyps actually engaged in this demolition passed on the morsels to their more distant fellows, as an ever-widening area of the wall awakened to activity. In an appallingly short space of time, they had reduced their prize to a tattered skeleton and withdrew into their lairs. Recovering from their temporary disorganization, the attackers surrounded Matawamba even as Sancabriel had foreseen. The revolving turret belched steam like an angry dragon. A quartet of dynapods succeeded in laying hold of the machine and tilting it sidewise before they were driven off. Immediately, the turret spouted an upward column of steam and uttered a deafening hoot. It seemed that answering hoots mingled with the ensuing echoes. Ilrai and his companions were still hovering above the river and drifting backward toward the Hermes from the force of the explosions. "Perhaps these little weapons of ours may be of some slight assistance in this encounter," thought the Martian as he drove himself upward with a couple of vigorous flaps and leveled his gun at a dynapod which was circling in toward the steam-enshrouded dome. The recoil of Ilrai's shot threw him halfway to the Hermes. The red streak of his rocket bullet, enhanced to crimson in the blue moonshine, stabbed the broad back of the dynapod, exploded there into a blood-red star of flame. And now the voyagers from Alkerhaven beheld another one of Kenya's grim surprises. The flare of the bursting bullet continued to burn, spread over the dynapod's back in slow rivulets of fire. The creature uttered a dreadful cry, twisted its long neck backward, beat at the flame with its hands, and the hands themselves ignited. "Great balls of fire!" shouted Himberling with unpremeditated aptness. "The thing's combustible!" "I'm sick!" choked Rodney, turned and fled through the air to the Hermes. The other dynapods were stopped in their tracks by the spectacle of the slow transformation of their comrade into a writhing, horrendously vocal conflagration. Then they fled up the hillside in wild retreat. The retreat became a rout when they found themselves confronted by a compact battle line of quarter-size replicas of Matawamba's machine, sweeping down from the ridge to a hooting accompaniment of shrill steam sirens and preceded by a wall of live steam. The battle line became a crescent, drove them headlong into the river. Their towering horns plowed desperately across the blue sparkling current, passed close under the bows of the Hermes. Ashore, the now motionless dynapod burned down to a smoldering patch of red coals, bones and all. 7. In the quiet of his cabin aboard the Hermes, Ilrai flattened out the first page of a new journal with his big rubbery fingers and proceeded to fill it with vertical columns of twisted Martian script. "In a sense, I am responsible for our predicament. When I published the Eden story, I was careful to point out that it had come to me by a long and devious route, passing from world to world by word of mouth and probably gaining much in the telling. It never occurred to me that Earth might harbor a sufficient number of dreamers to embark upon such an ill-advised pilgrimage as the Marco Polaris expedition, merely on the strength of that story. Of the Marco Polaris, I heard only that it set out with a party of colonists and vanished without trace. Now that story has trapped us on Kenya. We were warned by our leader that events might bring about such a situation, but I think that very few of us really believed that it might happen so. We have seen much of these wall makers in the days since our first meeting with Matawamba. The Earthlings are individualists with a genius for things mechanical. The Martians are individualists with a genius for things metaphysical. Both learned the lesson of unity only at the price of bloodshed and battle, but the Kenyans, living in what is to them a giant world, possess an innate devotion to unity. They could not have survived and become what they are otherwise. Their peculiar genius is biological. They mold living things to their ends as the Earthlings mold the inorganic world. Until relatively recent times, theirs was, let us say, a biocultural civilization without machines. They were ripe for a mechanical era when Matawamba arrived. The entire race of wall makers is congregated in one vast community behind the living walls. As their numbers increased, they made successive additions to the circumference of this area, which now measures 140 miles in diameter. Only the outer walls are alive, kept so by feeding upon the organisms floating in internal circulating streams of water sucked up from the sea and whatever incidental creatures are snared by the polyps. Matawamba has fancifully christened the community Chicago, since his researches have revealed that this terrestrial city once constructed railroads on elevated tracks. The symmetrical network of walls, a growth of ages, was sighted from the Hermes during its descent on Kenya. The wall makers themselves are strangely reduced, delicate variations of the dinopod pattern. If one can imagine a plump, worm-like being standing with the forward half of its body erect and armored with the jointed carnipus of an armadillo, he will have a general idea of the wall-maker anatomy. The carapace is mottled with tortoiseshell markings. Like the dinopods, they possess 12 limbs, but stand on 8 only. The other 4 are grasping organs, multi-fingered as the fronds of a fern. 4 opalescent eyes peer from under a visor-like projection of the head shell. The fabric of their minds is puzzling, cryptic but friendly. I can plumb only the shallows of their thoughts. The continual encroachments of the Kenyans on the surrounding outlands are resented by the creatures which Matawamba appropriately calls the dinopods, the thunder-footed. I know of no exact parallel to these beasts elsewhere. They are less intelligent than the wall-makers, more intelligent than the elephants of Earth or the Araganths of Alcorhaven. They have hands and a barbaric type of culture. I am told that they have communities of their own, but these I have not seen. Possibly I am mistaken, but I feel that Counselor Saracen was antagonized by my shooting of a dinopod. At least his manner seemed to convey such an attitude. He was not concerned about the one which was slain by a shell from the Hermes. An entry in Counselor Saracen's private log verifies the disapproval which Ilrai suspected. In it, he disparages Ilrai's exploit as sheer exhibitionism, claiming that the patrol of wall-maker machines was already visible on the crown of the ridge at the moment when Ilrai fired his shot. He avers that the cremation of the dynapod violated the established policy which prohibits, quote, wanton and unreasonable destruction of fauna, end quote. Other unrelated entries reveal that Counselor Saracen cherished a secret pride in his prowess as a hunter of big game for scientific purposes. There may or may not be a connection between these facts. Saracen also expresses himself regarding Ilrai's Eden story in much the same words as The Martian, with an added angry comment that Ilrai would do well to make sure of his facts before bursting into print. 10. Matawamba was primarily a teacher and student of languages. Within the field of his model-building hobby, he was well-versed in the theory of steam engines and the construction of railroad equipment. Beyond that, his technical knowledge was nil. But contact even with this small fraction of terrestrial science, together with the African's tantalizingly general descriptions of other earthly achievements, had fired the wall-makers with an avid desire for more. Neither of the parties to this interchange of ideas was physiologically capable of acquiring the speech of the other, but early in his residence on Kenya, Matawamba had mastered the written language of the wall-makers. So it was through Matawamba that the Hermes was invited to shift her moorings from the river to an anchorage inside the walls, far from the dynapods, who had developed a disagreeable urge to pelt the ship with boulders and gobbets of decomposing offal, as was already their custom to throw at trains. Her new berth was the arm of a lake, adjacent to a railroad terminal. The terminal shops constantly grew more serviceable for certain minor needs of the Hermes under the expert advice of Sancabriel and others. After checks and rechecks 100-fold repeated, Counselor Saracen admitted what he scarcely dared to hope. The atmosphere of Kenya was safe. Safety suits were ceremoniously discarded. The Hermes flung open her ports, and the voyagers inhaled heady draughts of the richly oxygenated air, knew once again the feel of wind and rain. The ship admitted a delegation of Kenyans, who inspected her from deepest hold to shield deck, chirping and babbling with wonder. On this epochal day, Matawamba conferred with Counselor Saracen in the latter's cabin. "In one way, this may be good news to you. In another way, it isn't," began Saracen, drawing luxuriously on a long-deferred cigarette of Alcarhavian tobacco. It burned very rapidly in the Kenyan atmosphere. "There isn't the slightest doubt but you contracted Cassiopeian gangrene. 2 things saved you: a high natural resistance and the fact you made Kenya in a hurry. This high-oxygen atmosphere inhibits the disease. You still have a slight latent infection of the spleen, but the lesion is healing, and it isn't contagious, and it never will be if you stay on Kenya. We can cure it, but it will take a long time. Even if we were permitted to send you back to Earth now, and could, you'd have to spend at least 5 years in an oxygen chamber after you got there, isolated in a remote Antarctica hospital, and we'll be here longer than that. We haven't done 1/10 of what we know we must do." The creases in Matawamba's face seemed to deepen. "I feared something like this," he said slowly, "but I shall have many things to do, and time will pass swiftly. Ilrai has been training me to listen with my brain, as he terms it, and there is something at the terminal shops which you must see." At the mention of Ilrai's name, Counselor Saracen elevated his eyebrow and inhaled so strongly that his cigarette emitted a shower of sparks and burned nearly to his lips. He hastily spat the glowing stub on the deck and ground it vindictively under his heel, as if Ilrai were responsible for the incident. "Very well. Let's shove off, he curtly assented. From the Hermes they came forth into the ultramarine dusk of the Kenyan day, filled with the drumming roar of a solid downpour of rain and the unremitting roll of thunder. The clouds rippled with lightning, and their infrequent transitory rifts were stabbed through by steel-blue broadswords of sunlight. The two men splashed across a wide field among close-set ranks of 5-foot spheres, glistening darkly through the rain, the swift-growing vegetable bladders which secrete the fuel oil of Kenya. Beyond this, they picked their way through a network of narrow tracks, stepped cautiously between miniature 10-foot tank cars, which stood in long files upon the sidings. Saracen paused and regarded the lights of the shops, a watery blue-white blur through the descending torrent. Had the Kenyans invented a new kind of oil lamp? He demanded. They were never so bright before. You'll see, grinned Matawamba. Stooping through a rugged archway of coralline material, dead and devoid of polyps, the earthlings stood with their heads nearly touching the roof and surveyed a brilliantly lighted labyrinth of clamorous little machines, spinning pulleys and flapping belts. Scores of quadruple eyes glanced up expectantly from their work. "Arc lights?" cried Saracen. "Who did this?" "Several people," Matawamba informed him, grinning delightedly. "The wall makers, Ilrai and I. Now we can have motors and do away with all these belts and pulleys. On Earth I got all the electrical devices for my models ready-made. When I came, we tore down all the gadgets in the lifeboat and still knew nothing when we had ruined them. But Ilrai brought at least a ton of books and microfilms with him on the Hermes. He dug up some stuff on elementary electrical engineering, dictated telepathically while I wrote it out in the Kenyan tongue. Sankabriel was in it too. He helped with the mathematical part and the shop work. We've made a direct dynamo of sorts, but it does work." But Counselor Saracen said nothing. He stood quite still, his face a mask, while the water dribbled from his rain-suit. The glow of pleasure slowly faded from Matawamba's eyes, and he became crestfallen. "What's the matter?" inquired Matawamba anxiously. "Isn't it all right?" "I did not order this to be done," observed the counselor icily. "Unfortunately, we cannot revoke this technical information which already has been released. In releasing it, you have committed a flagrant violation of general policy. The regulations explicitly prohibit the very thing that you have done. They clearly forbid us to supply scientific information to any species capable of using it before we are thoroughly familiar with its temperament and mental attitudes." "But I am thoroughly familiar with the wall makers," protested Matawamba. "What are you driving at?" Both turned at the sound of Himmerling's voice behind them. "As I recall the wording of the regulations," said Himmerling, "they forbid the disclosure of the theory and methods of production of any lethal weapon, implement of war, explosive, toxic gas, incendiary device, or any other socially destructive information. They also say something about means of navigation in vacuo. Are you going to tell us that you consider an arc light an implement of war or a socially destructive influence? You choose to be trivial," retorted Counselor Saracen. "Are you prepared to guarantee that from this innocent-seeming arc light and the generator which activates it, these wall makers will not go on to the incandescent bulb, the simple vacuum tube, the cyclotron, nuclear physics, the stereodyne, and the space warp drive? Even our superior Martian friend admits that, so far, he can understand only the simplest mental patterns of these beings. Can you see into their minds? Even if you could you be sure that you saw everything?" Suppose they do go on to those other things. What then? Countered Himberling. They are obviously a nimble-witted and inventive race, and quick to learn, responded the counselor. I presume that you have no forebodings as to what they will do when they escape from the confinement of these walls, occupy their world, and overrun the galaxy. Yes, I have no forebodings, affirmed Himberling stoutly. Matawamba's 32 years of association with the Wallmakers give his opinions a weight that should outbalance all of ours put together. And as to their overrunning the galaxy, don't be foolish. We're doing quite a bit of overrunning ourselves, and there have been times and places when the galaxy didn't appreciate it. But our purposes are benevolent, ejaculated the scandalized counselor. Are you hinting that the Kenyans would ever be anything but benevolent? Boomed Matawamba in a voice that was heard throughout the terminal. This is not a military organization, which for the first time I regret, Counselor Saracen remarked ominously. We are all responsible adults, theoretically, and we know the regulations. But as field director of this survey, I promise you that if any more technical information is given to the Wallmakers, I shall report for insubordination everyone who may be responsible as soon as we have made port on Alcorhaven. Ilrai's case I shall present directly to the biplanetary governors. Cool off, advised Himberling. You won't see Alcorhaven for again 10 years. And as for preferring charges on Earth, well, you know how often the mail goes out. You won't even remember it by then. He grasped Saracen by the arm. You need a walk in the rain, said Himberling. I'm dissecting a dynapod. It's a rare sight. You'll enjoy it. Matawamba squatted dejectedly between two axle lathes, produced an affair like a flexible slate from a waterproof pouch at his belt. He disdained a rain suit, and began a solemn written conversation with the Wallmakers who immediately surrounded him. 9. I expected a whole dynapod. This is just a head and neck, remonstrated Counselor Saracen. And why did you break the horn? His huntsman's eye perceived the grisly bulk as a damaged trophy. It lay under a low-vaulted pergola which had been grown, not built, illuminated by a pair of sizzling arc lights. On every side were archways curtained by rain, opening on a world of crepuscular blue. I didn't break it, Himberling replied, flexing his fingers in his surgical gloves. This fellow did it himself, last night, in a fight to the finish with another gladiator. It was just outside the wall. You should have seen it. They wrestled and tore up the ground like a couple of power shovels running amok. He didn't win, as you might guess. When it was all over, Matawamba took me out in his tank, and we severed this much and dragged it in. The remaining carcass was worthless. The Outlands scavengers had been at it. Where's the rest of the horn? It was sticking in the victor's rump when I last saw it, and he was wringing the welkin about it. You'd better put on a respirator. This odor doesn't seem so bad, but it will lay you low if you breathe too much of it. Now, here's something. This armor plate, these bones, they're wood. Don't look so skeptical. It's incredibly tough and almost as hard as iron, but it's wood. The whole animal is oily and resinous inside, but it is an animal and not a plant, I guess. The horn also? Yes, the horn is wood also. I suppose it was rammed in between two other bones. We'll have to call them that. And something had to give. And here's another thing. I've dissected out an eye. Fixed lens, movable retina. Very curious. You've surely made a wreck of this, lamented Saracen, walking around the partly dismembered head. You should have another one, complete, to dissect in its entirety. He found himself confronting Rodney, masked and gloved, who until then had been occupied with the muscles of a massive arm and hand on the other side of the huge cranium and completely hidden by the latter. "I heard you," said Rodney, "and I know just what you're thinking. You'll go and bag a dynapod for scientific purposes, and when we start working on it, you'll claim the head because, you'll say, we've already had this one. Then you'll take it back to Alcorhaven and hang it on the wall in your quarters opposite the Araganth." "It's an idea," returned Saracen, unabashed. "Why don't you?" urged Himberling, speaking across the snout of the dynapod. "I think we all need and deserve a holiday. I'm taking mine right now, carving up this beast. For 18 months I've seen nothing but slides and cultures and photographs and caged animals. Matawamba will give you expert advice on organizing the hunt." "This is a map of Chicago," announced Matawamba, unrolling a bulky scroll of vegetable parchment. He spread it upon a circular table of spongy mineral material in the form of an inverted, truncated cone, which had been caused to grow from the floor of the chamber he used as a workroom. Above it, a coralline stalactite supported a cluster of Kenyan oil lamps shaded by translucent marine shells, which diffused a mellow orange light. The microfilm projector stood in an alcove. The walls were a museum of railroad models interspersed with files of mechanical drawings. "It looks like a big flower," Rodney commented, bending over the map. "A chrysanthemum, to be exact," amended Saracen. "We saw it from the Hermes coming down." "You'll notice this long, straight wall extending 30 miles to the northwest and ending in a loop," Matawamba continued. "That's the causeway I told you about. It's complete, and the growth has been halted, except for the loop at the end, which is just beginning to grow. The loop is about 7 miles across and encircles a mountain of iron ore. A 4-track railway is already laid down along the causeway, and when the loop has reached its full height, we'll extend the line and start taking out the iron. A clan of dynapods formerly lived on the mountain. They're still incensed about being driven off, and have built themselves another kraal somewhere in the vicinity. At night, when the foraging parties come out, you shouldn't have much difficulty in locating a specimen. Usually they come up to the causeway and heave a few dornicks at it, just on general principles. But I can't guarantee that you'll get your specimen after you bring it down. They carry away their dead and wounded." "We'll fascinate them with a small portable searchlight," explained Saracen. "Then I'll select my dynapod and pick it off at leisure with a Humboldt rifle, the same one I used for the Araganth. It fires a steel-jacketed, non-explosive bullet. Will you handle the light, Matawamba?" "I'll use a steam jet in self-defense," replied Matawamba with a grimace. "But this lying in wait and calculated slaughter, no, I'll have nothing to do with it except to provide advice and transportation to the end of the causeway. Your purpose is legitimate enough, but just the same, count me out." "Let me take the light. I'll be the decoy," volunteered Rodney. "But tell me this, how do you intend to bring back your dynapod after you get it?" "Heavy-duty levitation harness," answered Saracen. "You've seen it, on bales and crates when we load or unload cargo. 4 5-ton units should be enough to float a dynapod. One of Matawamba's locomotives will tow it in like a captive balloon." "Why don't you take one of the launches?" Rodney inquired, referring to certain aircraft auxiliaries of the Hermes. "They're all out making surveys," the counselor informed her. "None of them will return in time. We're going out tonight." 10. Under a full moon, the outlands had become a panorama of endlessly variegated blues. Rodney was not yet sufficiently accustomed to these blue nights of Kenya to accept them as completely real. For her, they still possessed a certain dreamlike quality. She lay prone in a swaying, jolting 10-foot railway gondola, clutching the case of a portable spotlight. Counselor Saracen reclined in the other end of the car, his Humboldt rifle and its folded tripod across his knees. A scudding streamer of oil fumes and exhaust steam from the locomotive billowed overhead. Peering forward past the side of the tender and the spinning drivers, Rodney squinted against a barrage of pelting steam droplets at 4 parallel pairs of rails, which converged toward a dark blue butte on the horizon. 8 silvery blue splashes of moonlight fled along the rails, keeping pace with the orange glow of the headlight. 4 other gondolas and a caboose followed the first car, creaking and clanking. They carried rolls of heavy-duty levitation harness. Himberling, San Gabriel, others of the Hermes Company, and the Kenyan train crew. It was Himberling's intention to secure specimens of other nocturnal Kenyan fauna after assisting in the transport of the dynapod carcass. "There must be another train ahead of us near the end of the line," Rodney announced as they drew near the Iron Mountain. "I see 2 lights, red and green." Saracen craned over the side of the gondola, scanned the 2 luminous dots, and shook his head uncomprehendingly. At the end of the causeway, the 30-foot right-of-way expanded into a circular platform. The hunting party drew up alongside another train consisting of a locomotive, 2 gondolas, and a caboose. Matawamba was stretched out comfortably in a gondola, his head pillowed on his arms, contemplating the moon and smoking a cigarette, a luxury obtained from the Hermes, while he blew occasional smoke rings for the edification of his Kenyan train crew. "Why are you here?" inquired Counselor Saracen. "I came out with Ilrai," replied Matawamba, raising his head with his clasped hands. "Ilrai?" "Yes. He comes out here frequently to take pictures. The wildlife is more plentiful than it is nearer to Chicago. See, there goes one of his flashes." A soundless white flare blinked among the northward ridges of the outlands. "Is he alone?" "Why not? He's wearing levitation harness. He knows about your plans and is going to keep well away from the river." "You mean the river that loops around the other side of Iron Mountain?" "That's it. I want to tell you something about it. If you fly half a mile due north from here, you'll come to a place where the dynapods go down to grub around in the river bottom. The shore is all trampled to a quagmire, and there are 3 islands opposite. There's another bed of mussels. That's not what they are, but one can call them that. About 1 mile upstream under a bluff with a copse of sponge trees at its foot." The chevaux de frise of horny spikes and blades along the rim of the circular platforms was broken at 2 points where the mountain-encircling loop branched off. At these points, the causeway sloped steeply downward from its 30-foot elevation, graded into northerly and southerly extensions, entirely covered with the defensive polyps. To the earthlings, the embryonic walls suggested broad, slightly elevated beds of animated, pallid, blue-white flowers. Rodney and Counselor Saracen stood poised at the northerly break in the protective fringe. Rodney's spotlight was secured by straps around her neck and waist. The counselor's gun and tripod were slung across his back, thereby leaving arms and hands free. They pressed the weight control studs on their belts, leaped, flapped, and soared northward. "There's the river and the 3 islands under us," said Rodney after an interval of leaping and soaring. "I'll sail around and look for dynapods while you go down and set up your gun." The huntsman found the trampled, muddy shore as Matawamba had foretold, and established himself on a knoll which commanded every approach. The back plates of dynapods, which slough off periodically, lay all about him. Rodney's voice came to him through the radiophone headset, which his telepathic deficiency made necessary. "The forest is too thick around here," announced Rodney. "I'm following a couple of dinopods now, but I can get only glimpses of them down under the sponge trees, and I haven't been able to get at them with the light at the right angle. Now they're coming into a clearing under me. I'll catch their eye now. No! They saw one of Ilrai's flashes and went off that way to investigate. They're under the trees again." Saracen fumed. He also had seen the flash and was glaring toward the point where he had seen it when an erect black object appeared on the summit of a distant hill. It stood out sharply against the blue-green auroral zone which rimmed the horizon. His first thought was that it was the head and neck of a dinopod. Immediately, he pivoted his rifle toward it, threw himself prone, and clapped his eye to the rangefinder. Just as he found the object with this instrument, it extended a pair of wings, flapped, and floated upward. No sooner had he realized that his rifle was trained on Ilrai than a murderous impulse leaped from the crypts of his subconscious like a flicker of dark lightning. If he had fired half a second sooner, it would have been a mistake. Why couldn't he have fired sooner by that half a second? Even if he fired now, who could say that it hadn't been a mistake? "You could," came Rodney's clear voice, like the voice of sanity, with a startling appropriateness which stilled his tightening finger on the trigger. "You could move upstream to the other place that Matawamba spoke of." Pause. "I'm all out of training," Rodney went on. "This flapping wears me down. I'm sitting on top of a sponge tree getting my wind. I was about to say that the forest thins out north of here, and I'll stand a better chance of luring a dinopod into the open. If you move upstream, I'll try to bring one to you there." "Check. I'm taking off in half a minute," mumbled the counselor, still somewhat distraught, and began to dismount his rifle. As he leaped and glided along the riverbank toward the appointed place, Rodney spoke again. "I've spotted a fair-sized herd," she informed him. "They're headed for the river. In a minute they'll be out in the open, and there are no trees from there on. There's a beaten trail to the river. Here's one coming out of the trees now, ahead of the rest. I've turned the light full in its face. This should be easy. It follows like a dog on a leash. Are you ready?" "I'm not quite there yet, but I think I see the place," responded Saracen, leaping prodigiously. "I can see your beam distantly, to starboard." He overshot the bluff rising from its cluster of sponge trees, reversed his course, and in his haste to descend and mount his gun, he came down less circumspectly than he might have done otherwise. The dinopod trail came down to the shore of a deep cove, partly enclosed on the upstream side by a curved rocky peninsula. Against this arm of land, a backwater eddy had accumulated a mass of miscellaneous floating debris which had been invaded by vegetation from the shore. It was mated together into a solid raft with a resilient peaty surface anchored by water roots and creeping stems rooted on land. Even to an unhurried inspection by illumination other than blue moonlight, it would have appeared deceptively solid. Saracen descended on this surface and released the support of his harness when his feet were yet a few inches above it. The resulting impact of his full weight, plus that of his equipment, ruptured the fibrous raft and plunged him most disconcertingly into a slimy tangle of river flotsam. For a moment he clung to the edge of the opening he had made, digging his fingers into the crumbling peat, and called into his radiophone, "Rodney! San Gabriel! I'm—" Then the weight of his rifle and tripod tore him loose from his insecure grip, and he found himself submerged in a repulsive web of slippery, mud-coated roots, nondescript floating matter, and inky black water. With grim rapidity, he slipped off the shoulder strap which supported his weapon, battled his way back to the surface against a nauseating, glutinous, clinging resistance. For a moment he was dismayed by his inability to find the hole through which he had plunged, and clawed among the roots on the underside of a floating mat. It was like thrusting his fingers into a nest of angleworms. He broke surface gasping, trod water, felt for the studs on his belt. The lift power of the harness responded soddenly, raised his shoulders only half a foot from the water. The apparatus had not been designed to withstand total immersion, and his wings had become involved with driftwood. "I'm stuck in a bog," he broadcast to whomever might hear. "My harness has hardly any lift in it. Tell Matawamba it's at the foot of the bluff. I think I can hang on for a few minutes." But no one heard him, and his earphones brought no reply, because his radiophone was not adapted to submarine service either, which he realized as soon as he had spoken. However, his first cry, abruptly cut short, had been heard. A rapid interchange by direct mental communication took place between Rodney, Ilrai, and the party on the causeway. Rodney, being nearest, was the first to arrive, having followed the Dynapod trail to the river. Her spotlight revealed Counselor Saracen's features, unrecognizably besmeared in the midst of the bog. She detached the light and set it on the shore, with the beam directed vertically as a beacon. "Don't walk on this stuff," warned the counselor. "It's a mere crust with deep water under it." "My harness won't lift both of us," said Rodney as she maneuvered into a position above him. "But you can hang on to my feet until the others get here." The full power of Rodney's harness lifted her companion from the water scarcely to his waist. "I believe I can thrash my legs around and break a way through this mess to the shore, if you'll tow me along," declared Saracen, but did not execute the plan. The bedazzled Dynapod, which Rodney had abandoned, had reverted to its original intention of coming down to the river to grub in the shallows. It announced itself by uttering a deep bass groan and smashing the spotlight with a sweep of its horn. It then proceeded to pick up objects alongshore and fling them at the two earthlings. A hematite pebble slogged into the morass, further bespattering the counselor's face with muck. A burr-like mass the size of a baseball sang past Rodney's ear. Her lurch to avoid it caused her to wheel downward about the pivot of her foot anchored in Saracen's grasp. She smacked solidly against the soggy, felted surface, thrust an arm into its gelatinous depths. Both began a series of lunges toward the open water, while further missiles threw up muddy geysers about them. The fibrous mat started to break up under this double assault. Little islands of it drifted out into the stream. A forceful current gripped the pair and swept them beyond the range of the Dynapod's bombardment. "Our harness is so much dead weight," gasped Saracen. "Get rid of it." So, while they rose and sank in the frothy swirl of the disintegrating bog, gagging on involuntary mouthfuls of mucid water filled with ambiguous particles and fibers, the two laboriously divested themselves of their detachable equipment. It was in a small way consoling to remember that 18 months' research had disclosed no aquatic organisms which were pathogenic toward terrestrial beings. "What do we do now?" queried Rodney, floating face upward. "Strike out for shore." "Well, of course, but which way is it?" Their eyes, close to water level, perceived only a rippling, bubble-studded blue expanse in all directions under a stratum of mist. Overhead there was nothing but the glowing violet-blue sky, the blue coldness of the indifferent moon, a few great stars. "I'm going to contact Ilrai," Rodney began, then uttered a choking gurgle and was silent. A giant eddy had engulfed her. Through the turbid medium, Saracen saw her spinning like a top, a dim blue shape under the point of the vortex. 11. The baffled dynapod stamped impatiently, glared with its 4 moonstone eyes into the blue river mist which had covered the escape of the pair of strange animals. It surged into the water a few paces, raising billows worthy of a side-wheel steamer, uttered an angry whoomp when it trod on the sunken Humboldt rifle. Plunging its head and neck beneath the surface, it bubbled like a hippopotamus while it sought for and retrieved the weapon and its tripod. Then it sloshed ashore, trailing strings of water weeds to examine its find. The simplicity of the tripod was uninteresting, and the dynapod cast it aside after bending and twisting it with its huge bands, strange hands, with a long central finger from which 2 rows of other fingers sprouted on either side in the same manner that the veins grow from the midrib of a leaf. But it was intrigued by the trimness and complexity of the rifle, and when the remainder of the herd appeared, the gun was passed from hand to hand to be felt and inspected. Their inspection was cut short by the sound of steam sirens which heralded the approach of a Kenyan tank patrol. The entire herd stamped up the trail toward the protection of the forest, taking the rifle with them. Scarcely 3 minutes had been occupied by the encounter of Saracen and Rodney with the dynapod and their subsequent escape. No greater lapse of time had occurred from then until the retreat of the dynapod herd. The thunder of their departure was still faintly audible when Ilrai soared over the bluff and descended, having maintained his course even after the vertical beam of Rodney's light had been extinguished. He set off a series of photo flashes to guide the others who were converging on the spot. Very shortly, the shore of the cove became a confusion of light and sound as Sancabriel and the party from the causeway flapped down from the sky, to be followed by the hissing miniature tanks of the Kenyans which rumbled up along the riverbank. Matawamba, being without harness, had remained behind. "Rodney's light, smashed to bits," groaned Himberling. "And look at this tripod, twisted into corkscrews. Dynapod tracks all over the place. They must have been ambushed from those trees." "There is no sign of bloodshed," thought Ilrai. "It is my opinion that they were carried off alive." "If Rodney's alive, why don't we hear from her?" thought back Himberling. "And where is Saracen's rifle?" "Rodney may not be conscious," insisted Ilrai. "I feel that she is alive. The rifle may be nearby where it fell in the water." A thudding crack sounded remotely. The manipulations of the dynapods had accidentally fired the gun. "That was a shot!" exclaimed Sancabriel. "There's your answer. Saracen is alive anyway, and that was his way of letting us know." In the short silence which followed, the slapping of ripples along the muddy shore seemed unnaturally loud. "Ilrai, you've been training Matawamba and probably can get through to him better than any of us," Sancabriel rapped out. "Have him instruct his engineer to run back along the causeway at top speed and whistle up all the patrols within hearing. We'll throw a cordon around the whole forest. Have the wall makers call in all the patrols they can spare, and that can get here within an hour, and get out all the reserves in the 3 nearest sectors of Chicago. Tell Matawamba to stand by in Chicago at our liaison man with the wall makers. I'll contact the Hermes. She'll have to go to the other end of the lake to take off. She'd make a shambles of the terminal yards with her negative field if she took off from where she is now. I can get someone else to handle Matawamba's juggernaut. Himberling, you try to make contact with the launch on island number 7, and tell them to come in at once and report at the end of the causeway. They're not much farther away from here than the Hermes. We'll give these dynapods a memorable night, something they can tell their great-grandchildren about." Matawamba, reclining in his gondola, was suddenly galvanized. He scribbled furiously on his writing tablet, showed it to his Kenyan train crew, who scurried to their posts. The train rolled backward, gathered speed, fled down the causeway in reverse, its whistle screaming a coded alarm. Across the dreaming blue of the outlands, there rose an answering medley of remote hootings as the roving tank patrols, alert for Vandal Dynapods, acknowledged Sancabriel's order. Elevated gateways clanged open in the living walls, let down their bascules to the sound of chain and ratchet, disgorged reinforcements. Far away, a third of the way around Chicago and across the strait on Island Number 7, there was a running and a shouting in the encampments about the Hermes and the launch. 12. Rodney's head lay on Saracen's chest as he swam backward, clutching her with one arm. Her body trailed flaccidly in the water. Her eyes were closed. Her face was still and blue-white under the moon. Was he swimming parallel to the current, across it, or in spirals? He could see nothing but blue water, blue mist, the alien sky. The moon was almost at the zenith. No chance of getting his bearings there. These unfamiliar Kenyan constellations. Just how was he looking at them? Something loomed darkly through the mist. The shore? No, a little island. He drove himself grimly toward it. There were no shallows near it. It rose abruptly from the water. He crawled upon it, dragged Rodney after him, commenced the measured routine of artificial respiration. The island was soft and springy underfoot, overgrown with bulbous-leaved creepers which trailed in the river. He glanced up from his rhythmic concentration and was surprised to see 3 more islands some distance to port. 3 islands? They must be the same 3 he had used as a landmark. Had he drifted so far? He resumed his ministrations to Rodney, glanced again, and blinked. The 3 islands had shifted upstream. Comprehension dawned. It was his island that was moving, a buoyant mass torn loose by the diurnal flood from upstream marshlands. There was Iron Mountain forward, rising above the river mist. That would be south, and this would be the nearest approach of the river to the causeway before it swerved westward around the mountain. His sense of direction returned. The constellation became recognizable. By now all hands will have turned out to find us, he reflected. There'll be no one at the railhead except the wall makers with the trains, and perhaps Matawamba. With all the power of his lungs, he shouted repeatedly, "Matawamba!" And the mountain threw back his cry, a plaintive bleat. While he continued to labor over Rodney, fighting the inertia of protesting muscles, his navigator's instinct automatically observed the changing relation of stars and mountains as the river swept westward and back again. Perhaps 2 hours elapsed while he stuck doggedly to his task, remembering the age-old maxim which governs such emergencies: "Don't give up." The river water evaporated from his clothes in wisps of vapor, and he drenched them again with perspiration which was not altogether the perspiration of ultimate fatigue. The salty fluid stung his eyes, streaked his face with the bog mud still matted in his hair. Rodney's eyelids quivered. She sneezed and opened her eyes. Saracen collapsed on the mossy turf. One of the creepers had wound a tendril about his ankle, but he did not notice it. From the waist down, he seemed to have petrified. From the waist up, every muscle was a creaking agony. "Come out of it, Rodney," he wheezed. "I think you'll have to work on me now." The floating island passed into the blue obscurity of a deep gorge where the river seethed noisily between echoing, water-sculptured walls. The high crags along the brink of the chasm reflected a sapphire glow of moonlight into the depths. Foaming cross-currents buffeted the raft of vegetation, sent it rocking and revolving against stony snags which tore off fragments and launched them upon swirling independent careers. A sudden bend in the stream flung the crumbling mass within arm's length of the canyon wall, stranded it on a pebbly shoal. Saracen and Rodney stood with their backs against a vertical wall of slippery rock while the shallow torrent tugged at their ankles. They watched their raft vanish piecemeal into the dark threat of the canyon, down a staircase of tumbling cataracts. 100 feet if it's an inch, shouted Saracen above the tumult of the waters, gesturing upward. If we were snails, we'd have a chance of crawling to the top. I believe that we've come clear around Iron Mountain. We should be somewhere south of the railhead. I'm still groggy, responded Rodney. Where are we? What happened to Ilrai? The sky northward from the causeway was blood-red with flame and turbulent with boiling, red-lit smoke. The Hermes swooped low above the Holocaust, and the trails of rocket bullets radiated from her in a fabric of intersecting crimson lines. Sancabriel was making good his promise that this night would be memorable in the folklore of dinopods. Himberling and 3 others of the Hermes party, including 2 of Rodney's feminine colleagues, stood upon a smoldering hill, leaning wearily on their rocket rifles, wings dropping cape fashion. They looked down upon the smoking vestiges of what had been a grove of sponge trees. In a world which rains every day like this one does, one wouldn't expect to find things so easily inflammable, Himberling remarked gloomily. Who would have thought that a burning dynapod would start a forest fire? Where's Ilrai? Ilrai returned to the causeway, replied one of the girls. He has a curious idea that Rodney is alive, possibly Counselor Saracen also, and that we're looking for them in the wrong place. He can't explain why he has such a suspicion. The silhouettes of a squadron of Kenyan tanks appeared against the flaming sky on a neighboring ridge, then dropped from view. A flapping black shape rose against the glare, swooped down upon the hilltop. It was Sancabriel, a tigering gleam in his eye, and Saracen's humbled rifle in his hand. "Look at this," he snarled. "We know how fast these dynapods can travel, and how they could have taken Saracen and Rodney. We found the herd that did the deed. They had this rifle with them. Nothing else. Do you know what the beasts have done?" He shook his fists aloft, clutching the rifle. "They've eaten them!" At a later date, Ilrai wrote in his journal as follows. Human nature being as it is, it was perhaps inevitable that 1/3 of the dynapod population of Island No. 7 should be massacred in one night. In all fairness, I must say that Martian nature, under an equal provocation, very likely would have reacted in the same way. Nevertheless, it was a tragedy. It is true that the dynapods are Kenyan carnivores, or rather omnivores, but a study of their habits has revealed not only that the flesh of terrestrial creatures is repugnant to them, but that when they are induced to consume it by artifice, they become violently ill and may even die from its effects. Such incidents remind us that we are essentially but half civilized. Ilrai paced nervously back and forth along the edge of the circular platform at the end of the causeway. He was oppressed by a feeling that the glowering red flare in the northern sky was the symbol of a ghastly error. Some deep resonance of mind with mind, even with an unconscious mind, told him that Rodney was alive, and not up there under the smoke of the burning forest. He could no longer contact the minds of the dynapod slayers. They were altogether absorbed in a fury of revenge. Ilrai's mental sendings were no more heated than the chirpings of a canary in a riot. The emanations from the onslaught were red, Ilrai brooded, like the red in the sky. A Martian became rigid. A voice sounded in his brain, the voice of Rodney's thought. "Ilrai," came the call. "Ilrai, am I coming through?" "Yes," responded Ilrai. "In the names of Phobos and Deimos, where are you?" I'm with Counselor Saracen." "I knew it." The friends of the imperturbable Martian would have been amazed to see him execute several steps of that time-honored terrestrial foot rhythm known as the hornpipe. "But what is your location?" "The counselor says we're south of the causeway. We're in a canyon and we can't get out. It should be easily seen from the air. Is anyone with you? I've tried to contact Himberling and some others without success. Their thoughts are terrible. I can't make them out. It's like trying to talk to a hurricane." "I am alone on the causeway and I can contact no one. But wait, I have forgotten Matawamba. He remained in Chicago. I must devise a plan of action." Along the rim of the platform were various little shelters where the wall makers stored tools and supplies. After further mental interchange, Ilrai extracted from one of these shelters a coil of rope spun from Kenyan silk. The gondola containing his photographic equipment stood on a siding. From this he removed the photoflash apparatus. A touch on his belt studs reduced his apparent weight to 8 ounces, and a soaring leap sped him southward. 13. "Every joint in my skeleton is like a rusty hinge, and growing worse," grimaced Saracen, unsuccessfully trying to sit on a ledge 3 inches wide, while he supported Rodney with one arm. She was not yet quite steady on her feet. "What does Ilrai report?" "He sees the canyon, Counselor," replied Rodney. "Your estimated bearings are fair enough. We're about 2 miles south of the railhead." "Counselor," repeated Saracen with a frown of annoyance, "I have an individual name of my own in case you're not aware of it yet." "Of course your feet are wet. So are mine. We're standing in water." "I was trying to remind you that my name is Jeffrey," said Saracen, raising his voice. "I can't hear you. The river makes so much noise." "I'm suggesting that you call me Jeffrey, blast it!" shouted Saracen, and filled the gorge with new reverberations. "I couldn't do that. It wouldn't be good for the morale of the organization," Rodney admonished gravely. "There's Ilrai's first flash. He's over the canyon." "Tell him that he's about 1,000 feet to starboard," Saracen moodily directed. 2 more flashes, followed by telepathic responses from Rodney, brought Ilrai to a point directly above the stranded pair. He secured one end of his rope around a pinnacle of stone, swung on the rope with his full weight, then allowed the coil to unroll downwards. The overhang of the cliff made the free end splash into the middle of the torrent, which promptly swept it downstream. Ilrai reduced weight, let the rope run through one hand while he floated down, sighted the pair at the base of the cliff, flapped toward them with the end of the rope, handed it to Saracen. "I shall now go aloft," Ilrai thought to Rodney. "There I shall remove my harness, since it lacks sufficient marginal lift to support both of us. Fasten one of its loops around the rope, and let it slide down. It will fit you very loosely, but it will serve to carry you up. Then we shall repeat the operation and bring up the counselor. I have contacted Matawamba, who is on his way now by rail with additional harness. He is a novice at harness flying, but he should be able to bring the paraphernalia from the causeway over this short distance. My flashes will guide him." Rodney's removal from the canyon was effected without mishap. She threw one leg outside the oversized belt and ascended as in a breeches buoy. But when Rodney sent the harness down the rope to Saracen, Ilrai's rescue plan suffered a miscarriage. The descent of the harness made its wings balloon with air and billow outward. One wing caught on a projection of the cliff. Since the line ran loosely through the harness, and since Saracen's movements were limited by the small extent of the shallow in which he was standing, no amount of tugging and shaking would dislodge it. "I'll bend the line around me," bellowed the counselor. "You'll have to haul me up." When he had completed his preparations and shouted his readiness, Saracen waited expectantly, but the line continued to hang slack. Two pebbles cracked against the opposite cliff in quick succession and rebounded into the river. One plopped into the shallow at the counselor's feet. "Watch the loose rock up there," he shouted. Came a tremendous heave on the line, which left him spinning in mid-air, a yard above the stream. Equally tremendous heaves jerked him upward 10 feet at a time. Saracen marveled at Ilrai's strength. When he approached the point where the line slid over the bulge of the cliff, he thrust out his feet and came up running, with Ilrai's harness over his arm. He was confronted, not by Ilrai, but by a dynapod hauling in the rope as if it were a fish line. Ilrai's flashes had served as beacons to eyes other than those for which they were intended. The dynapod was not alone. A battalion of its fellows stood in irregular ranks upon the rocky terraces behind it. They were abnormally quiet, as if they waited in an expectant hush. Occasionally they stamped, snorted softly, shook their armored heads. Blue gleams shifted up and down their colossal horns, slithered over the knobs and corrugations of their jointed backplates. Rodney was seated on the ground at the feet of her captor, tenderly feeling her head. There were dark stains on her fingers. "They sneaked up on us and threw stones," she informed Saracen bitterly. "Can't they do anything but go around throwing at people? I saw them in time to duck. It was only a glancing blow, and I volunteered as a decoy. Ilrai's out cold. Maybe he's dead. I don't know." Geoffrey's eyes followed her pointing finger, beheld Ilrai sprawling limply. A hot surge of anger rose within him. Then he was dumbfounded by the picture which flashed across his memory. He saw a man. Could it be Counselor Saracen? Sighting along a gun barrel at a hated image in the rangefinder, his finger taut upon the trigger. "There's nothing we can do now," continued Rodney. "It's their move." The three were surrounded by a company of dynapods, who held a consultation over them in subdued, hollow, guttural noises. Ilrai's harness was snatched from Saracen's hand. Rodney was raised roughly to her feet. The conferees bent down their heads and sniffed cautiously at their captives through olfactory tubes at the bases of their horns, then stamped and tossed their heads in evident distaste. "The big oafs," muttered Rodney. "They're no rosebuds. I wish I could tell them. They smell like vinegar and turpentine." The upshot of the conference was that Rodney and Saracen were firmly bound with many coils of the line which Ilrai had provided, after it had been severed into two portions by one snap of a dynapod's jaws. They were curious, intricate jaws, with a multiplicity of serrated mandibles and quivering palps like the mouth of an insect. The inert Martian was left unbound. "These knots! Did you ever see anything like them?" exclaimed Saracen, making a mental note even in the midst of his distress concerning Ilrai. 3 dynapods took charge of the captives, carrying them gingerly at arm's length as if they were an unpleasant sort of vermin. Why they should have taken Ilrai remains something of a mystery, although it has been established that the dynapod mind entertains a superstitious regard for the unburied dead of their own kind or of other worldly races. The entire company set off across the outlands at a rapid trot in the direction of the causeway, then broke into an undulating gallop. The plain boomed and rang under their battering wooden hoofs until it seemed that the very sky must be shaking and thundering. Geoffrey, swinging through dizzy arcs in the fist of the galloping dynapod, caught glimpses of a flame-reddened sky, saw the flashes of the Hermes guns below the horizon, heard their detonations like great doors slamming in the heavens above the rumbling thunder of the Dynapodian charge. The charge slackened as it drew near to Iron Mountain, halted at the railhead where the causeway sloped down to the germinating wall. "What goes on here?" Rodney called weakly to Saracen. "A buried treasure hunt?" A gang of dynapods were laboring frenziedly at an excavating project. Some were plowing up the gravelly soil with their horns. Others were scooping up loose material with what appeared to be dynapod backplates and heaping it upon the immature barrier. The defensive polyps were entirely buried along a 50-foot section and up the incline which gave access to the railhead platform. The workers, who had deposited the final shovelfuls at the head of this ramp, threw down their scoops and mounted the platform, sent the whooping echoes flying among the precipices of Iron Mountain with their triumphant, abysmal bellowings. "It's an invasion!" cried Rodney, "and not a patrol in sight." "The patrols seldom come out this far," Saracen responded as their dynapods grunted up the newly created ramp. "No regular trains to protect. From the looks of the sky up north, all available forces are there." A brusque shaking admonished them to refrain from further conversation. Advancing along the causeway, 3 abreast, the dynapod column was headed by the trio bearing Rodney, Jeffrey, and Ilrai. The Martian remained lax and unresisting, like a grotesque ragdoll in his captor's grasp. It is impossible to say what motive lay behind the dynapod's foray. The railway ramps inside the circumferential wall offered easy access to Chicago, but the existence of these ramps must have been unknown to the invaders, or at best a shrewd surmise. Whatever havoc they may have planned to wreak upon the wall makers, they must have known that they risked certain ultimate destruction at the hands of the Earthlings. Perhaps they had no thought save of desperate suicidal retaliation for what was to them unprovoked wholesale slaughter. Some genius among dynapods may have schemed their attack under the stress of revengeful passion. The 4 parallel tracks stretched to the horizon ahead of the advancing column. Southward, the outlands were blue with moonshine. Northward, they were sullen red under the fiery sky. The dynapods were blue on one side, red on the other. Jeffrey noted dully that a brilliant star had risen above the horizon, continued to hang there as if resting on the rim of the world. A dim sense of astronomical irregularity stirred within him. He scanned the heavens. This star did not fit into his knowledge of the constellations as seen from Kenya. How odd that it should have appeared at the very vortex of the converging tracks. He regarded it with heightening interest, becoming alert. It was below the horizon now. Little quivers of light ran down the rails before it. It was not a star. 14. The Kenyan locomotive builders had been quick to perceive the superiority of the electric arc over their previous oil-burning headlights. It was one of these later models which was now bearing down upon the dynapods. It was, in fact, Matawamba's personal car, used for inspection tours, with a specially constructed tender which permitted him to squat behind the cab and manipulate the controls. He flashed his intentions to Rodney. The hypnotic attraction of the dazzling light, he hoped, would induce the dynapods to forget their captives and provide opportunity of rescue. "Suppose they throw us down and walk on us," shuddered Rodney. But the dynapod reactions were not precisely as Matawamba expected. The Cannier advance guard bowed or averted their ranks, goggling in fascination and elbowing each other. Saracen's custodian galloped in advance of the others and held its prisoner suspended above the fringe of glittering blades which bordered the causeway, indicating by pantomime that if the locomotive continued to advance, the Earthling would be allowed to fall among the razor edges. Matawamba was thrown into confusion by this unforeseen stratagem and hastily applied his brakes. But the Dynapod's naive mechanical ideas included no concept of momentum. If the locomotive were going to stop, they reasoned, it would stop dead, immediately. Moreover, the threatened sacrifice of Geoffrey was pure bluff. They had no intention of losing their hostages, if it could be avoided. Therefore, when the locomotive continued to pound down upon them, all three of the leading Dynapods cantered toward it, tossed their captives upon the track before it, and retreated a short distance. Their sole desire was to halt the onrushing menace and overturn it. Saracen's shin cracked against one of the rails, and an explosion of pain flared through him to his fingertips. Rodney fell on top of him, but Ilrai landed on his feet. Ilrai, who had feigned death in the clutch of the Dynapod while his winged thoughts sped across the miles to Matawamba's brain, revising his plan of rescue to meet the changed situation. With one four-handed sweep, he gathered up the two Earthlings and stepped aside as Matawamba's locomotive rolled past and creaked to a halt with a singing sizzle of steam. The Dynapods stood immobilized by this miracle of the reanimated corpse. "2 gondolas behind," Matawamba directed briefly. "Put them on and cut the ropes." And it was done. Not until the rescue train had attained half speed in reverse did the Dynapods awake to action. Then they charged after it, while the causeway trembled. For a few moments it seemed they would overtake it, but their pace was no match for the mounting speed of piston-driven wheels, and soon they were invisibly distant. "My leg!" Geoffrey groaned from the floor of the gondola. "Your leg? How about my head?" retorted Rodney. "A sledgehammer wouldn't make a dent in it," responded Geoffrey through his teeth. Matawamba looked over his shoulder. "We're not through yet," he shouted above the iron roar and clicking tattoo of wheel on rail. "We still have to stop the Dynapods." He jerked a thumb backwards. Geoffrey raised himself painfully on one elbow and looked over the rear of the gondola. Matawamba's train was hammering along track 1. The headlights of 3 more locomotives were approaching via the remaining tracks. Matawamba reduced speed, halted with a jerk, started forward with groaning drivers, was overtaken and passed by the hissing onrush of the 3 other trains, caught up with them again. Now the 4 locomotives raced together in perfect alignment. 4 pairs of compound cylinders beating in unison, harmonized in locomotive orchestration. Kenyan engineers leaned from the cab windows of the other 3. Each tender was followed by a flat carrying a heap of oil-soaked rubbish and a string of tank cars. 20 tanks in each train," called Matawamba, "and all the domes are open." At a blast from Matawamba's whistle, the other locomotives fell back, arranged themselves en echelon, with Matawamba in the lead. The second gondola of his train was adjacent to the flat car on the next track. Each flat car was opposite the engine cab of the next train. The long-legged Ilrai now strode from train to train across the diagonal path of flat cars, ignited the heap of rubbish on the outermost one, stepped back to the third, lifted the Kenyan engineer, who coiled worm-like about his arm, from the cab of the 4th locomotive, reached through the cab window and opened the throttle wide. The 4th train shot ahead, running wild and trailing a banner of flame. He had repeated this operation on the other 2 trains and transferred the 3 Kenyan engineers to the forward gondola when the air was shaken by the thudding jar of an explosion to the rear. All eyes looked back to behold a tank car belching pompons of flame, ignited by flying sparks, falling into the open dome and rapidly overtaking them. "We'll be cooked alive if it passes us," called Matawamba. "This is the one thing I was afraid of. We can outrun it. This is a light haul." "Outrun it?" shouted Rodney. "We don't have much of a margin. I think I can see the Dynapods ahead of us." "We'll have to chance it," was the reply as the gondolas lurched forward with a crash of couplings. Another tank of oil let go with a boom, showered blazing puddles across the causeway. Interminable moments passed while they raced the uncontrolled train in a damp reek of hot iron and oil-laden steam. They drew ahead of it while the rear of their transit was punctuated by the detonation of exploding oil. "Ilrai, listen to me. I have something to say," began Geoffrey, breaking a long silence. The Martian, crouching over him, half rose with a movement which expressed surprise, then inclined his eye-encircled head as if to indicate, "I am listening." It seemed that he had said aloud, "I am listening." "Tonight, when I set out with Rodney, I almost shot you for a dynapod," Geoffrey continued. "In fact, I almost shot you anyway, even after I recognized you." The Martian rose to his full height, swayed with the swaying gondola, looked down at Geoffrey with eyes that glowed like phosphorus. It was impossible. Ilrai could not speak, but Geoffrey thought that he had said, "You have changed, Counselor Saracen." "I didn't say anything," replied Rodney to Geoffrey's question. "We're stopping here. We're half a mile ahead," barked Matawamba. "Jump as soon as you dare and run across the tracks." "Geoffrey can't jump," shrieked Rodney, unheard by that individual because he had fainted when Ilrai hastily lifted him from the floor of the gondola. Earthlings and Martian lay flat on the farther side of the causeway as the blazing oil train swept past them, leaking streams of fire, then ran breathlessly in the opposite direction. Ilrai still carried Saracen. Behind them, as they ran, glancing backward, 3 successive shocks rocked the causeway as the wheeled projectiles plowed into the dynapod column, piled up with screeching metallic din in buckling junk heaps of steel which toppled from the wall in volcanic ruin. Crimson mushrooms of flame vomited skyward, tossing up ragged shreds of metal and meteor-tailed fragments of the would-be invaders. Fiery cataracts poured from both sides of the causeway. The rearward portion of the column fled in trampling panic, jostling each other from the wall to lie helpless on the outland's plain. And when the flames on the causeway had died down among the twisted wreckage, and only a dark smear of faintly reddened smoke obscured the stars in the northern sky, the gaunt, unearthly forms of the outland scavengers came stalking under the blue moon to the aftermath of carnage. 15. A protesting feminine voice echoed along the hall of the Hermes sickbay. "But I'm not suffering from shock," expostulated Rodney. "All I have is a bump on the head, and it was a dirty trick taking off half of my hair." "You'll stay in bed until I tell you differently," admonished Himberling. "We'll grow the hair back fast enough when that scalp wound is healed." "How about Geoffrey?" demanded Rodney, abandoning protest as futile. "Nothing serious there, a simple fracture of the left tibia, various lacerations and bruises, general muscular stiffness, but I'm afraid he's a little delirious. He insisted that we bring him a bit of cord, and now he's tying and untying knots and muttering, 'If a dynapod can do it, so can I.' That isn't delirium, it's merely persistence. You'll hear about it in due time. Any other casualties? Where's Ilrai?" "Ilrai is in his cabin, filling another volume of his journal. He came through unscathed. No, he wasn't hit in the head. You can't sneak up on a Martian with panoramic vision. He flopped almost as soon as the stone left the dynapod's hand. Geoffrey's sudden metamorphosis into a budding telepath has excited Ilrai tremendously. He'd work with Geoffrey 12 hours a day if we'd let him. He's still theorizing about it. thinks that Jeffrey failed the first time because he was afraid of failure, but doesn't quite understand the emotional mechanism of the change as yet. But he will, and then watch out for a 50,000-word thesis. There are some other casualties. Your pal Wanda was burned on the arm by a falling sponge tree. Archer was gored in the shoulder by a dynapod. Campione was seared across his shoulders by a rocket bullet. 3 cases of partial suffocation by smoke. That's all. We haven't had so many people in the sickbay since we landed. As soon as Himberling permitted, his patients were requested by Captain Jutland aboard the Caduceus to make personal reports by radio. The signals were relayed through a remote-controlled robot transport poised outside the ionosphere of Kenya. The proceedings were in fact a conference. The participants on Kenya could see and hear Captain Jutland via installations at their bedsides or in their cabins, and could hear each other. Captain Jutland could see and hear all of them at once in his conference room on the Caduceus, a round chamber completely encircled by a frieze of contiguous telescreens. Ilrai, a master telepath whose range exceeded that of all but a handful of exceptional Earthlings, none of whom were connected with the sanitary service, utilized direct thought transference. After hearing varied descriptions of the dynapod hunt, which turned into a miniature war, Captain Jutland remarked, "In other words, Jeffrey went out to bring in a dynapod, whereas they brought him in. How does it feel to be a victim of the chase, Counselor?" "It feels like a broken leg," responded Jeffrey. "I'll watch out for Boggs next time." "Next time, you'll go over to 7, observed Sancabriel. "According to latest reports, all the surviving dynapods lit out and swam the strait." "You may feel that Kenya is a difficult assignment," Captain Jutland went on. "It isn't. You haven't seen a really difficult world yet, with, say, 2 or more mechanized races, all hostile to you and to each other, and an assortment of nasty parasites and infections which thrive on human meat." "I'm not sure that I want to see any other worlds," declared Jeffrey. "What's that?" "When we've finished, some of us will stay behind to make preparations for the first immigrants. That's the usual procedure, I understand, if the world is finally certified." "That will be some time in the future, my boy. Among other things, we'll have to be sure that Matawamba is absolutely 100% cured, and that his infection isn't latent in some form of Kenyan life." "I have decided to remain on Kenya also," interjected Matawamba. "I can't bring myself to abandon my railroad. It's the biggest model I ever had." "Model builder rejects Eden in favor of locomotives," commented Captain Jutland. Then to Jeffrey, "Now tell me why you want to stay with the permanent base party." "This world grows on one. You'd have to be here to understand. You'd have to see the days of rain and thunder when things grow while you watch them, and the sun breaks through like a cloudburst of light. You'd have to see the blue nights. It's like having 2 worlds in one. Even the dynapods. There's an aura of power about them. However, there's a condition." He hesitated. "I'll stay if Rodney stays with me." "What does Rodney say?" inquired Captain Jutland. "I haven't said," announced Rodney succinctly. In his bed aboard the Hermes, Jeffrey was aware of a faint infiltration of Ilrai's thought into his brain. He was still the veriest novice as a telepath, and the Martian's thoughts came through with a quality of incompleteness and indefiniteness, as if words were left out. As nearly as it can be represented in print, the general effect was something like this. "Ordinarily, do not private reflections, others, but if promise not to divulge source information, and if be allowed, borrow peculiar expression, Matawamba Delver dead languages would say, Rodney, female earthling, characteristic giving you the works. Although this communication was not directed at Rodney, it activated a dim tremor of resonance in a hypersensitized area of her emotions. She sensed that something was transpiring in the Martian's mind, although they were in different compartments of the Hermes, which concerned matters very much present in her current reveries. An arrow of thought, barbed with suspicion, twanged into the Martian's brain. "Ilrai, keep your nose out of this." And his response came back, bland as fine oil. "I cannot do otherwise. I have none." These exchanges, swift as beams of light, were imperceptible to Captain Jutland. "Let us reserve our decisions until the time for them arrives," he advised. "But before signing off, I must say that, as an improbable sequence of improbable events, what you have just told me isn't likely to happen once in—" He groped for a phrase, failed to find it, concluded with an air of compromise. "Well, not once in a Martian lifetime." You've been listening to pre-1990s speculative fiction readings with a highlight on science fiction by Darrell T. Smith II. Please consider clicking the donation link in the description box. Thank you so much for your time and your imagination.